Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Davis, and I'm the coordinator of Alex Stone's project, Production and Marketing of Dry Farm Tomatoes in Oregon. And this project was funded by Western SARE. Back when the Dry Farming Collaborative started, the tomato variety that farmers were most interested in growing was Early Girl, which is pictured here on the left. This is because Early Girl is a tomato that is grown throughout coastal California using dry farming techniques, and it's garnered a cult following. The article above, Organic Dry Farm Tomato Production for California's Central Coast, is a great article if you'd like to read more about their production system. However, when we trialed Early Girl across diverse Willamette Valley sites in 2018 and 2019 as part of our dry farming site suitability studies, we found that the variety is highly susceptible to blossom end rot, averaging around 50% on sites that were exposed to the wind. So blossom end rot is a physiological disorder that causes tomato fruits to develop this large black sunken spot on their undersides, which is pictured here. And this makes them unmarketable. And the reason that we believe that this is such a problem in Oregon compared to coastal California is that the Willamette Valley is hotter and drier. The climate in coastal California, the climate that's recommended for growing dry farm tomatoes is cool and humid with morning fog. And unfortunately, the Willamette Valley is it's much hotter and drier during the summer growing season. And this may result in higher incidence of blossom end rot for Early Girl tomato. And this relationship between dry farming and blossom end rot has long been known. The table here is from an extension article that was published back in 1922 called Vegetable Gardening Oregon by Arthur Bouquet, who's pictured on the right. So this table shows that blossom end rot increases as irrigation decreases. And you'll also notice that varieties differ in their susceptibility to blossom end rot. So because the California system did not work well in Oregon, in 2019, Alex Stone wrote a proposal to Western SARE to research dry farm tomato production in our hotter and drier climate. And this talk will discuss those 3 years of trials. So in our first year of trials in 2020, that year we trialed over 200 different varieties of tomato, and you can see them all here. This is a drone photograph. And many of these varieties we focused on were reported to be resistant to blossom end rot. We also trialed 5 different rootstocks using grafted tomatoes, as these have been shown to be resistant to blossom end rot. And you can see we collected a lot of data about the tomatoes in this picture on the bottom left here, including fruit counts and weights for tomatoes with light blossom end rot. So that was just little bits of pricks of blossom end rot on the blossom end. Heavy blossom end rot, which was that sunken black spot. We had other physiological disorders like sunburning, splitting, and gold top. And then finally, marketable tomatoes. And we collected all this data at every harvest for these 200 varieties. So it was a lot of work. One of our big takeaways from 2020 was that grafting has a big impact on dry farm tomato production. Tomato grafting takes a disease and drought-resistant rootstock and pairs it with a tasty tomato scion. So 4 of the rootstocks were shown to improve dry farm tomato production. Hold on. And these were Fort Amino, DRO141TX, Maxifort, and Imperador. These rootstocks increased fruit yield and size and decreased the incidence of blossom end rot. You can see this demonstrated in the pictures on the right using the scion BHN871 and the rootstock Fort Amino. And these photos were taken on the same day. So you can see the grafted one had many more fruit, and many of these fruits were not affected by blossom end rot. And then on the bottom, the BHN871 had fewer fruit, and many of the fruit were affected by blossom end rot. Another big takeaway was that saladette and cherry tomatoes were very flavorful, and they were also highly resistant to blossom end rot. Because these varieties had very little blossom end rot, and because they were so laborious to harvest, we stopped trialing them after the first year. These 2 pictures are of varieties that did really well. The one on the left is Rosa de Benevento, and it had very high yields, especially later in the growing season. On the right is the Gold Nugget cherry tomato, which was bred at Oregon State University. These are among the earliest of the tomatoes that we trialed and were very tasty. Of all the varieties that we trialed, those 200 varieties, about 48 of them were shown to be very blossom end rot resistant, which we defined as being tomato varieties that had less than 15% blossom end rot. And here are some pictures of our high performers that we ended up trialing all 3 years. One thing you should note about the high performing varieties is that many of them were open pollinated varieties as opposed to the more conventional hybrids that organic vegetable farmers have come to rely on. So in 2021, we were excited to trial our blossom end rot resistant varieties again, and this time with both grafted and ungrafted versions. 2021 was also full of other possibilities now that pandemic restrictions had started to lift, including doing on-farm trialing of these high-performing varieties, both grafted and ungrafted. So on the right are some pictures of these varieties that we trialed on farms, including Marmande, grafted and ungrafted, and also a Zoichka. And you can really see a difference in the size between the grafted and the ungrafted tomatoes. However, 2021 had its own share of difficulties, including a heat dome event at the end of June that resulted in plant damage due to the high temperatures. And this may have been partially responsible for increased blossom end rot and reduced fruit quality during the 2021 growing season. 2021 was also the first year we were able to resume in-person events and tastings. And this allowed for us to see how consumers and farmers responded to these high-performing blossom end rot resistant tomato varieties, along with more conventional blossom end rot susceptible varieties like Early Girl and Big Beef. So popular tomatoes in these taste tests included Early Girl, Big Beef, and Bee Orange. And in 2021, taste tests showed that tasters preferred ungrafted dry farm tomatoes over grafted dry farm tomatoes and also over irrigated tomatoes. So those ungrafted dry farm tomatoes were the crowd favorite. Big takeaways from the 2021 growing season were that the grafted tomatoes continued to perform well, though they were less popular in taste tests. Also, many of the blossom end rot varieties that were trialed were unpopular with farmers and tasters. So many of them were soft and had short shelf lives, and some of them suffered from other physiological disorders like golden top. So this picture here is from the farmer's market. One of our farmer participants, took the tomatoes that we trialed and sold them at the market. And yeah, they were just not as popular as some of the more conventional hybrid cultivars like Early Girl and Big Beef. So after consulting with farmers and marketers, we decided that in 2022, we would focus on trialing grafted tomatoes with firm commercially available hybrid scions. Many of these varieties had been trialed in 2020 and had performed poorly as ungrafted plants. However, we knew that by grafting them, we would be able to improve their yield and reduce their blossom end rot. So we wanted to trial them again as grafted plants. And because we were pivoting to focus primarily on grafting, some farmers wanted for us to put on a grafting workshop. So here we had a panel discussion, which you can see on the left, where we had 5 grafting experts. And then on the right, we also had participants receive hands-on instruction on grafting technique, and they were able to take their grafted tomatoes home with them and were able to try to heal them. And many of them were actually successful and were more willing to graft tomatoes on their own because of our workshop. So if you're interested in learning more about grafting, I've included a link on the meeting homepage to a website that we put together, which shares tips from the panel discussion from the workshop. So now for our final year, for our 2022 trial, we had 52 rootstock scion combinations that we focused on. And we focused on primarily those commercially available hybrid scions. So here are a picture of a couple of the varieties that we trialed: grafted Big Beef and also grafted BHN 871. We also trialed some of our high-performing tomato varieties from 2020 and 2021 as ungrafted tomatoes again. And then finally that year, we grew some irrigated comparisons to measure differences in yield, fruit quality, profitability, and also to compare them in taste tests and using quantitative measurements of fruit bricks, which is the soluble sugars, and titratable acidity. So these drone photos here on the left were taken towards the end of August, and you can see how different the irrigated trials on the bottom there are from the dry farm trials on the top. You can see the irrigated ones are much greener, and then the dry farm tomatoes, those plants are much more yellow and chlorotic. We also did on-farm trials again of some of the rootstock scion combinations. We used BHN 871 and Big Beef grafted onto DRO 141TX and Bordamino as these have been shown to be high performing in previous years. So this table contains a lot of data, but really quickly, you can see on the leftmost column, we have the farm, and then we have the variety of the scion, so BHN871 or big beef, and then we have the rootstock, so Dro and Fortamino. And you can see that it's the same all the way down. So it's always big beef and BHN, always Dro and Fortamino. 3 of the farms had very high yields of large fruit. So you can see here in this column, we have the total yield. And then in this column here, we have the yield of large fruit. So those were fruits that were greater than 1/3 of a pound. And you can see for the first 3 farms, total yields was about 40 tons an acre. And then large fruit yields were around 30 tons an acre. And then the OSU Vegetable Research Farm and the Sweet Home Farm performed a little more poorly. The Sweet Home Farm had more of a forest soil that may have been less suitable for dry farming. And the OSU Vegetable Research Farm had a plow pan, about a foot deep. So it was a pretty thick plow pan, and that may have resulted in lower yields. And then unfortunately, blossom end rot actually was quite a bit higher than we were hoping for. If you remember, our goal, our threshold was 15% blossom end rot. And you can see for some of these farms, it was quite a bit higher, especially Sweet Home and Monmouth. And even for the heavy blossom end rot incidents, that's where it's the sunken black spot. Some of these farms had very high blossom end rot, heavy blossom end rot. So that was very disappointing. So from 2022, our big takeaways were that farmers and marketers were much happier with the hybrid varieties because they were firmer and they had a longer shelf life. However, blossom end rot was fairly high and averaged around 26% across the on-farm trials.
Hi, welcome to the Caritas. I can take your order whenever you're ready.
I'd like a bacon breakfast burrito with 3 greens.
That was a bacon breakfast burrito?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'm just going to kick that person off.
I muted him. Yeah.
Thanks. Where was I? All right, takeaways. So unfortunately, blossom end rot was fairly high and averaged about 26% across the on-farm trials for the BHN and the big beef. We also found that dry farming resulted in increased incidence of other physiological disorders, including golden top, which is pictured on the left there. That may have been because of reduced foliage. So when the dry farm tomatoes, if they had less foliage or if they lost some of the foliage due to powdery mildew, then sun would hit the fruit and cause it to heat up, and then that would result in this golden top. We found that 28 rootstock scion combinations were shown to be blossom end rot resistant in our OSU variety trial, including the one pictured on the bottom there, the damsel tomato grafted on the Fortamino. And then we also found that there were differences between the rootstocks and how they performed, with DR0141TX having higher yields of large fruit and Fortamino having a greater reduction in fruit with heavy blossom end rot. We also found that we spent about half as much time weeding the dry farm tomatoes compared to the irrigated tomatoes. The variety damsel grafted was among the most popular varieties at taste tests, and it actually outperformed early girl ungrafted in flavor at our marketers taste test. And then the final most concerning bit of data, along with the blossom end rot incidents, was actually this year tasters preferred the irrigated tomatoes over the dry farm tomatoes. It wasn't just that they couldn't tell a difference, but they actually preferred the irrigated tomatoes. And we believe that this might have been because we had a pretty severe powdery mildew in the dry farmed plot, and the powdery mildew is known to reduce soluble sugars in tomatoes. So this might just be an anomaly from this year, but I think it goes to show that dry farming isn't a guarantee of better flavor. And finally, we are still analyzing profitability data and Brix and titratable acidity data, and hopefully this will be available shortly in our final report. So in conclusion, after 3 years of experimentation, we have a few important takeaways. The first is that, unfortunately, we have still not developed a successful dry farm tomato production system for Western Oregon. We are confronted by a number of physiological disorders, not the least of which is blossom end rot, and these disorders can be extreme on sites even with grafting. However, I still think it's important to stress that we have found that grafting is an important technique in a dry farmer's toolkit and may be an important drought resistance technology in our changing future. Another important conclusion is that dry farm tomatoes are susceptible to more disorders than just blossom end rot, especially gold top. And finally, dry farming does not guarantee better flavor, especially if dry farming affects the plant's ability to resist diseases. Future work we would like to pursue goes in two different directions. First, we would like to continue to trial varieties and rootstocks to develop varieties that are blossom end rot resistant, tasty, high yielding, and resistant to diseases and other physiological disorders. And then the other avenue of future work we'd like to pursue is to continue to research methods of dry farming that reduce blossom end rot and other physiological disorders. We have evidence that interventions like shading and sheltering and reducing the amount of amendments applied can decrease blossom end rot. And we also know that trellising might reduce gold top incidence. Finally, I'd like to thank all the farmers who participated in our trials, attended our meetings, including all of you, and who showed such interest in the project. I'm truly grateful. I'd also like to thank all the student workers who have had over the years. And finally, I'd like to thank the professionals and OSU staff who have worked on this project. So unfortunately, I've gone a little bit over. I don't know if we have time for any questions.
Yeah, I think probably we can try to save that for after Yvonne's presentation, and then well, let's do a couple questions, and then we can cut into the break a little bit. How about that?
Okay.
Yeah. So Patrick asks, how are the calcium and boron levels in experimental plots? Those are the elements I see cause BER when deficient.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. I could go back and look at it. One thing that we've found in our data is that blossom end rot actually can be exacerbated by too many amendments as these nutrients are applied. This can cause the plants to grow luxuriously. They get bigger, and that might make them more susceptible to blossom end rot later in the growing season. And I talk a lot about this on the YouTube channel in the 2021 soil management trial video. So you can hear more about that. I don't know about particular amendments like calcium and boron. And when we were doing the site suitability study, one thing that we found was that a lot of these nutrients are correlated with each other. And so it might be that because, farmers that do a really good job of adding nitrogen or phosphorus also do a good job of adding calcium. And, so we don't necessarily know if any particular nutrients are more or less important in that.
Great. Yeah. Dave Dixon asked, was spacing adjusted versus irrigated tomatoes? I'm also curious about trellising and pruning practices.
Yeah, so we did not space them any differently. The irrigated tomatoes and the dry farm tomatoes were planted in that third year, 2022, 6 feet between rows and then 2.5 feet in row spacing for about 15 square feet of plant. We generally find that higher density plantings of tomato result in increased total yield per acre and also reductions in blossom end rot. And then as far as trellising and pruning, we have trialed Florida weave as a method of pruning. And what we do is, we will generally prune up to that first fruit cluster and then let them go after that. And last year in 2022, one of the sites where we did trellis, we didn't prune at all. And those fruit had reduced gold top. And I think that might be because, when the branches are allowed to sprawl, they can break, and then that can expose the fruit to the sun. So trellising might be a really important, method for controlling gold top. And it's one that, hopefully we'll be able to trial in the future.